Here's 3 more quick reviews of Japan or Japanese related books that I have recently read. We're going to start with Life in a New Language, which is written by a whole lot of people. This is kind of a stretch, as there are Japanese people that appear in this book, but it's not entirely about Japanese. But I wanted to note it because, without any exaggeration, this is by far the best academic book that I have read this year. This is a fascinating series of investigations into the experiences of migrants coming to Australia and dealing with a new language or even a new variety of language. Many people in this book come with high English abilities, but are, like honestly myself was in some ways, surprised by certain features of Australian English and needing to adjust. The stories in here are rich and full of detail. The book is incredibly accessibly written, being very, very easy to read without much academic ease at all. And in addition to just being a great research project, and an incredibly impressive one given the amount of detail and number of people that are interviewed, it's one that has clear implications for policy and better understanding. Some of the saddest stories in here are, of course, ones where people come with incredibly useful skills, ones that are in demand here in Australia, and because of issues with getting those recognized, reaccreditation of qualifications, or just miscommunications that happen due to linguistic differences, they are unable to kind of activate these skills, use these skills, continue these professions here, and end up in situations that are less exciting. I also appreciated, though, that the book does have a lot of good stories, including a surprising one where an encounter with somebody who was quite racist initially did lead to someone finding a good job through communication. The book is about language, and even honest ones noting cases where communities that get together to help each other survive in these contexts spread information that's actually not helpful, with one person receiving negative feedback about their chances for getting a job from their local community and actually ignoring it and getting the job. I know it might seem kind of silly for me to say this because I did come to Australia with fluency in English and didn't have to take any tests, but I did see myself in some of these stories, and indeed my wife is an immigrant to Australia, and some of the things that she's told me are here too. And this is just a really delightful read about what it's like to go to a new place and have to work in the language. And of course, again, there are stories of Japanese immigrants in here too that have a lot of personal interest for myself and hopefully you. Fantastic book, highly recommended. Can't think of a single flaw. Really, really great read. Second book is then Translation and Translation Studies in the Japanese Context. This is a edited collection, and like all edited collections, some chapters are better than others, but on the whole, I found it pretty interesting. This is not a book about actually translating Japanese so much, though. If you want insight into like how translation is done or translation strategies, this book is not really going to help you that much. This book here by one of the editors is one that I would say actually is better in that regard. Rather, this is a book about studies of translation itself and translators. A lot of the chapters in this book talk about specific translators or specific translation styles, and there's a really interesting theme that runs through a lot of the chapters that really grabbed my interest, which is about how the act of translation itself has changed the Japanese language, looking at how Japanese translators that were first engaging with especially Western texts, but also Chinese texts, did things with Japanese that we now consider normal but were quite innovative at the time, and in doing so, helped create what we now understand to be modern Japanese. The idea that the Japanese language would not have existed without Japanese translators translating things. I also have to give a shout out to a very interesting chapter on differences in how Ainu place names were translated across time and based on the translators' ideologies. And it ends with a chapter that's quite dry but extremely interesting tale about community translation in Japan, or how migrant communities in Japan, similar to the last book I mentioned, are getting translation services. And it's very, very matter of fact, but it's very clear the author is extremely knowledgeable about the situation because they clearly identify a number of problems, such as the fact that medical translation, community translation, school translation are under different ministries, creating bureaucratic issues, a lack of pay for these people, despite incredible talent needed and weird hours, and then a lack of official certification, preventing something that Japan clearly needs as they lay out in statistics and policy documents. It's by far the least poetic of the chapters in the book, but it is one where you go, wow, I now know a lot more about that situation. So, on the whole, definitely recommended. Chapters are much more academic than the last book, and again, this is not about like the nitty-gritty of this is translated as this, but if you're looking into an overview of the study of translation in Japan, translation history, etc., there's a lot in here to like. Final book is then this one here, Nihongo no Himitsu. The title of this book is kind of boring. The tag here of a linguist goes and talks to experts in the use of language is much more interesting. I think it would have made a title. This book is okay. It's fine. There's a lot to like here. Basically, a Japanese linguist goes and interviews a Japanese poet, a Japanese rapper, a Japanese voice actor, and a Japanese person studying AI and language, and puts those interviews into the text. And the interviews themselves are pretty interesting. The 4 people that are interviewed are all definitely interesting people with interesting insights, and that part's all great. The issue is that the interviewer kind of spends a lot more time talking than listening in some cases. For instance, if you can see here, from this point on this page, all the way across here, and then all the way across here, to the end of that section, so there's no reply from the person being interviewed, that's just the author of the book talking. And I kind of get why. A lot of it is him providing like linguistics background, why these things are interesting to linguists, etc. But in my opinion, you have this opportunity to sit down with these people and really ask insightful questions that allow them to speak, and that doesn't happen a lot. There's unfortunately a lot of cases where he asks a question and the answer is like 1 to 2 sentences long, and then he asks another question that's paragraphs long and the answer is again 1 to 2 sentences. That doesn't ruin the book at all. Again, the interviews are interesting, the people being interviewed are interesting, but it does kind of sour the project for me a little bit. That said, if you're, say, around N2-ish level and you are interested in the Japanese language, this is a pretty readable book. That's one of the nice things. It is a very fast read. You will need a dictionary, but probably not a grammar one, as rather than being written like an academic book, indeed, even compared to Life in Another Language, which again was quite readable, this is all in pretty straightforward, casual conversation with all the weird things that make a conversation hard to follow cut out. So the book is eminently readable despite not being my favorite read of the year. But it sounds like something you're interested in. If the content is something you're interested in, and if you want Japanese reading practice, then I would say this is a pretty good way to start. Anyway, that's my reviews. Hope you found something to read, and I'll see you next time.